This week, official figures showed marriages are on the rise. However, we're still waiting further results from Holyrood's consultation on same-sex marriage. But in the meantime, a new opinion poll by the Equality Network suggests record support for same-sex marriage. Gillian Matheson has been looking at why equal marriage proposals have become such a big issue in Scotland.
Scotland's first civil partnership in 2005 attracted a crowd of press and TV crews. 7 years on, the SNP government is now considering whether to change the law to allow gay marriages in churches, but the move is opposed by some in the SNP.
Some of its members think or suspect that one of the reasons they lost so badly in Glasgow recently was on this issue. Of course, looking forward to the referendum on independence in 2 years' time, the SNP are worried that this might fracture their coalition for yes.
There has been pressure at Holyrood from religious organisations and by equal rights campaigners who say there's overwhelming support to legislate.
I think the majority of MSPs are clearly in favour of equal marriage. That confirms what the opinion polls say, it's what I find when I'm out and about, and it should give encouragement to Alex Salmond to move ahead with this right and normal legislation.
But there is still a strong voice in the Parliament saying that no person or organisation should be forced to be involved or to approve of same-sex marriage.
There must be protection for the churches and others who do not agree with this, who believe that two people of the same sex having a sexual relationship is wrong. That is a belief that not everybody agrees with, but that belief and religious belief must be protected.
In 2010, Argentina became the 10th country in the world to recognise gay marriage, and legislation is now being considered by countries across Europe. And in Westminster, David Cameron has backed plans to allow same-sex couples in England and Wales to marry.
It does have a lot of symbolic value, and if you want to look like a pioneer, a human rights pioneer, as Scotland may want to do as they move towards a referendum, politicians, LGBT movements and the general public realise that.
A new poll by the Equality Network reveals that of those asked whether same-sex couples should have the right to get married, 64% agree, while 26% disagree. And of those asked whether religious organisations should have the right to decide whether or not to conduct same-sex marriages, 68% agree and 21% disagree. The Scottish Government has insisted that no part of the religious community would be forced to hold gay weddings. It's due to publish the results of its same-sex marriage consultation later this month.
Well, with me in the studio from the Scottish Catholic Church is Peter Kearney, and from the Equality Network we have Tom French. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Thanks very much for joining me this afternoon. Tom French, to you first of all, I mean, your poll suggests a majority in support of same-sex marriage, but it would, wouldn't it?
Well, it's an Ipsos Mori poll. It's a regular poll they do. We didn't have any choice in who was asked. It's a representative sample. And yes, like you say, I mean, around the world, increasing majorities of the public are saying they support same-sex marriage. It's something that's supported in Parliament as well. Last week, we announced that a majority of MSPs have signed our equal marriage pledge, saying that they will vote for this. So what we're saying to the Scottish Government is listen to the public, listen to the Parliament, and you've got the green light now to go ahead with legislation.
Now, Peter Kearney, on this poll, does this show that the churches are out of touch with what the public are thinking?
I don't think the poll tells us very much. You're right to say it would show that, wouldn't it? And I'm afraid to say the poll is very deeply flawed because it's started with a very leading question. And when you ask a leading question, you tend to get a misleading answer. We've spoken to polling companies in the past on many occasions. It's always a good idea to avoid asking a question that says, should someone have the right to something? The public in general are very wary and unlikely to suggest a person shouldn't have a right. So when you begin your question by saying, should someone have the right to same-sex marriage, you automatically have distorted the result. And to be honest, the poll that matters is the 3-month-long consultation that took place at the end of last year. And in that one, we know the vast majority said marriage shouldn't be redefined. Well,
Tom, from the consultation, we are hearing that there's been a lot in favour of keeping marriage as it is. What are your red lines in this? I mean, we know what your ideal would be, but looking at what the David Cameron option, same-sex marriage but not in church, would you approve of that?
No, I think that would be unacceptable to anyone who believes in religious freedom, and we believe in religious freedom. Our proposal is that those bodies who don't want to conduct same-sex marriages shouldn't have to. But those bodies that do want to, so liberal Judaism, the Quakers, the Unitarians, should be allowed to. And I think most reasonable people would agree with that.
Peter Kiernan, just on that point though, what about this civil option, as we almost have in Europe and on the continent? Would you approve of that, but the churches wouldn't be forced into anything they don't want to do?
The reality is our current legislative framework, whether it be equality legislation at Westminster or European legislation, doesn't allow us to do that any more than liberal Jews could, for example, observe a certain speed limit on the motorway and Catholics or Baptists would observe a different one. When laws are passed, they have to apply on a blanket, on a universal basis. The opt-outs that have been talked about, unfortunately, by Tom and his colleagues, and I'm afraid to say by some members of the government, simply cannot be delivered. They are offering us a blank cheque that can't be cashed, and that's back to this issue of the equality legislation. They'll need to have blanket impact.
Tom, this is a key point, because we had a UK government minister saying in England, as far as this goes, that the churches perhaps can't be protected. You may make promises about this, but these could be hollow promises, because other groups may use human rights legislation to force churches to carry out same-sex marriage.
I mean, I'm not asking anyone to accept my promise. I'm asking people to look at the evidence. So in Europe, we have had same-sex marriage for over a decade now. There's now 8 countries around Scotland who have same-sex marriage. And in that entire time, there has never been one judgment by the European Court of Human Rights or any domestic court that has encouraged, let alone required, faith groups to conduct same-sex marriage.
Peter, surely that assurance allows you to go ahead with it.
Unfortunately, it's simply not true. We've already seen churches in Denmark, for example, being open to challenge and being compelled to go ahead with same-sex marriages, whether they wanted to or not. The reality really is what matters in Scotland. And in Scotland, the Equality Act of 2010, according to a leading QC's opinion in the last week, made it abundantly clear.
That was Aidan O'Neill.
Aidan O'Neill, correct. These protections, these exclusions, these exceptions cannot be delivered. We will be in the same position as we were when we were told that Catholic churches, adoption agencies would be protected. The Scottish Government couldn't follow through on that protection either, and we were left very, very vulnerable.
So we can't have any compromise from either side. You can't meet halfway in any way.
I think there's a bit of a distraction here, actually, because it's not for you just about protecting traditional marriage or your right not to have to conduct same-sex marriages. If I'm right in saying you actually oppose all same-sex relationships, and like Cardinal O'Brien said in December, you don't want to see any legislation that facilitates same-sex relationships, which he thinks are grotesque.
Well, let's pick up on that, even civil partnerships.
Let's begin by being honest about this, though. The law doesn't allow for the new legislation to apply to some and not to others. So let's just be honest and say there won't be protections. What you would prefer to see, Tom, would be compulsion. And in reality, that's what would happen. You'd want teachers to be compelled to teach children, whether or not they agree with it, that same-sex relationships are valid and should be prized. And you would, in the end of the day, create a situation where you would, first of all, criminalise people who didn't agree with you and could have them end up losing their position, losing their job, as we have seen happen in other countries.
Tom, your reassurances aren't holding much sway.
Well, look, I think the facts are clear. You know, Article 9 of the European Convention on Human Rights protects your right not to have to conduct same-sex marriages, and the facts are clear on that.
What I would say is we're calling for something very simple
for refusing. Here, Peter. We're calling for equal civil rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people. Now, of course, there will always be a minority that oppose the Black Civil Rights Movement, oppose votes for women, but I think, you know, in time, people will look back at this and think this was a progressive step.
Ultimately, same-sex marriage is not a human right. It is not a human right in accordance with the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. To equate it with sexism or racism is frankly completely wrong. It isn't that, and we have seen people be
Peter,
punished.
Looking at the advances made on gender equality and racial equality, is it not the same?
Well, no, it demonstrably isn't the same, and it isn't a right. And we've even seen a European court decision that said there wasn't a right to same-sex marriage. Now, a government may decide to go ahead and enact it, that's one thing, but they need to stop being disingenuous and pretending others won't be penalised.
OK, gentlemen, I'm sorry we've run out of time, but thank you both very much for joining me.